All right, let's start off today talking about travel and cultural exchanges. All right, so if we start at the 6th century current era, around 500 current era, the overall population of what we'll call Afro-Eurasia. Afro-Eurasia all the way here from West African kingdoms we talked about, getting Europe and all over Asia through here. So Afro-Eurasia started to rise considerably, and it kept growing for about 700 years. So like 500 to 1200, the population kept growing. So by the year 1250, the population was about 235 million. Then came the Black Death, which came in and actually eliminated up to 25 to 33% of the population of Eurasia and North Africa. At the same time this happened, there was what's called the Little Ice Age, historians call it, where temperatures cooled. We don't exactly know why, but the temperatures dropped for a large time, for several hundred years. And this led to an agricultural depression and declining population, especially in Europe, Russia, and China, possibly in North Africa as well. Now, this, however, didn't really last too long, and by 1500, though, populations again began to increase, and they reached 400 million. So we see, even with Black Death, even with this cooler temperatures, the population still go up to 400 million by 1500. So we see a general trend in history over 1,000 years of the population increasing. During this time, from 500 to 1500, was also the time of the great empires of the pastoral people, the nomadic people, the Huns, the Arabs, the Turks, and of course, the Mongols. And this was made possible by their technological developments. They invented the stirrup at this time for the horse, which allowed them to stay in their horses, fire arrows while moving at full speed, which is just awesome. And also the North Arabian camel saddle, which allowed them to ride camels much more easily. So Turkish-speaking nomads who rode on horses and Arabic-speaking camel nomads were the world leaders in mounted warfare, and this was basically your cavalry warfare. Cavalry warfare basically means by horse. So this pastoral power was also led to more trade as these people are going back and forth. It doesn't actually hurt trade. Having people move back and forth almost always increases trade in history. So we see these regions, this Afro-Eurasian region by the nomadic people, is actually trade links are increased, not decreased. So from there, what we see in this era, also we see the gold and salt trade in West Africa, as we've talked about, continues to grow along with the silk trade. Faiths like Islam spread into Mediterranean lands and in North and West Africa. At the same time, the Mediterranean region benefits greatly from this trade. This would include, obviously, North Africa, but also our white area here in the Christian world, which would be Europe, benefits from a lot of this trade as well. And key inventions start moving back and forth, so you don't have to invent a lot of these things. If it's invented somewhere far away because there's trade, you might get the invention and be able to copy it and use it and improve it. And the Europeans do a lot of this because they see a lot of inventions coming into their land from other parts of the world. Some of the key inventions that come in are the compass, the astrolabe, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, the triangular-shaped lateen sail, which allows them to sail further, so improvements in sailing in boats. Improvements in banking and business organization become more sophisticated. So what we see is there's these goods going back and forth, and as we talk about how Europe changes, Europe benefits from a lot of this trade because they'll be receiving these things. If you look on here, we see Europeans are involved in these trade routes, not as much as the North Africa, the Mediterranean region, the epicenter of it. But we see cities like Antwerp, Lisbon, Venice, Genoa on this map, that they will start to benefit because they will receive these trade goods as well. So China and India emerge as major manufacturing centers from 700 to 1500. Silks, porcelain, cotton are moving back and forth. And again, what we call Central Asia today, or Southwest Asia, our area of where we saw like Bukhara, Samarkand, near the Caspian Sea, Kabul on here, becomes a major area, a trade route. It's basically the area in the middle where we see a lot of these goods going back and forth. Again, gemstones, spices, silks, glassware, ivory. And all these things are slowly making their way in Europe as Europeans start thinking, hey, we want to see more of these goods. And as we talked about in our last unit, when the Crusades happen, it really opens the Europeans' eyes when they see the Muslim world, how much more advanced and how many more goods they have because of all this trade, and Europe wants in. So we also see the birth of cities at this time. Many of them are outside of Europe, but a few are in Europe. We see Istanbul, not Constantinople, Istanbul grows. We see the city of Delhi in India grows, Cairo grows, but also the city of Florence and several other Italian city-states, which because of their geography, the boot right here, and if you look at Europe, right near where Venice is, the big boot there, because of that geography location, they are able to get access to a lot of these goods that are coming in. So this is what the cultural exchanges, this is the really good part of it, is that all these goods are back and forth and societies are able to advance. Religions are also able to spread. As we see on this map, you see where the Buddhist world is, a large part of China over here. We see the Islamic world where it's able to spread throughout, we call it the Middle East, Southwest Asia, North Africa, and the one that's white is the Christian world, which is up here in Europe. I guess that's kind of appropriate. It's white. Anyway, so we'll continue here. Quick question for you. We're going to skip this one. This will be for class, but what do you know about Black Death or bubonic plague? In class, you will write that down for this online lecture. You can do that. You can pause the video right now, but I'll move on. There's also a video that you see linked on here. If you look up here, you can watch the video. This will be part of it. It will also be linked on the web page. So if you click on this, it'll also be on the WordPress site. You'll be able to watch the video. So in addition to the good things that are going back and forth, we also see there is some definite bad that happens, and that is the spread of the bubonic plague. So I encourage you to watch this video right now. Let me link this on the bottom where it says, you know, the description of this on the YouTube page, and you can watch it there as well. All right, now that you've watched the video, let's talk a little bit about the notes. So the spread of the plague, the Black Plague began to spread in about 1350 by the Mongols, merchants, and travelers. It thrived in large cities with many animals for flea breeding grounds. It's believed, although not proven, that the Black Plague spread with fleas, but there's some dispute about that, but many historians believe it was spread by fleas that were on rats, and we don't know for sure if this is true or not. It reached the Black Sea region by 1370, and by 1348, 1 year later, it was in Western Europe. The effects of the plague, Black Plague or bubonic plague or Black Death, both are acceptable. Lymph nodes and internal bleeding would happen. That sounds like fun. 60 to 90% of people who caught it would die. Whole towns could be wiped out in a few months. Now, some places didn't suffer because it was too cold, so more of northern Europe does not suffer through it as much, but southern Europe, like Italy, suffers a whole bunch because of the Black Plague. India, for some reason, avoids the Black Plague. I don't know why quite, but for some reason, India is able to avoid it. There's population decline. China gets hit by the Black Plague hard. The European populations decrease dramatically. The Islamic societies are also affected by the plague. And we see social and economic effects. The disease caused massive labor shortages, which led to social unrest. In Western Europe, workers start to demand higher wages because there's less people. And if there's less people to do the work, well, you can start asking for more money because there's not as many people to compete with you. This leaves people to leave their homes in search of better conditions and will actually lead to the growth of cities later on. Landlords respond to this by trying to restrict the freedom of peasants to move, which kind of works, but in the long run won't. The authorities resist change and peasant rebellions happen, so there becomes some social disruption, the loss of life during the Black Plague. The rest of this you can get from the video. Watch it from 13 minutes to 21 minutes, so watch about 8 minutes of it, from 13 to 21. Hey, how's it going? Recording my lecture. All right, so after the plague, actually kind of during the plague, but mostly after the plague, we see a big change happen in Europe as state building. Now, state, I don't mean a state like Minnesota. State, I mean like an independent piece of land. Like not empire big, but more like modern country big. Okay, it's going to kind of form the modern countries of Europe is basically what's going to happen. So there becomes a demographic recovery which strengthens Western European states, and regional states will develop, not an empire. And one of the biggest reasons that we talked about was because the Holy Roman Empire never becomes this big empire. And the reason for that, as we talked about, is because of the continued battles between the emperor and the church. But what happens is states start creating governments and get techniques that enhance their power. Basically, the Holy Roman Empire survives in name, but kind of becomes like little fiefdoms or little lands that are in Germany, and it's kind of like a period of warring states almost. It's like they get all these little bits of lands, kind of like Italian city-states. So it's not really an empire, it's more like a bunch of little kingdoms almost. But the kings of France and England fought over lands they both claim, and France and England both established their modern borders, as you can see by this map here. The orange becomes modern France, the green becomes modern England, and by 1453 we kind of get their borders where what will be established as what we know today as France and England. Now, they become two very powerful monarchies, and the way they get their money is, what happens is instead of the nobles getting their land and fighting against each other, the kings become kind of smart. They see a growth in commerce and trade, so they start taxing the merchants. They start taxing the people who get money directly. And they encourage more business to happen, more trade to happen, because then they can trade the merchants, which brings in money to them. And this allows them to form standing armies, large armies that are under control of the monarchy. Monarchy means, king or queen. Now, this makes them much stronger and allows them to centralize their power instead of having the power distributed amongst nobles, lords, and those people who, for most kings, are really kind of a pain in the ass. All right, so this happens in France and England. They establish their modern borders, so that's a big change, not really a continuity. Hint, hint for our essay. All right, continuing, major city-states become important in Italy. Italy goes more the city-state route. And this is still kind of true today if you go to Italy. A lot of Italians identify themselves more with their city or their small region than they do with their country. Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples become very important, and they also tax their people directly. And this allows, basically kind of like rulers of their city-states to arise. And again, France and England, more centralized, they form their militaries. And we also see Spain begins to be powerful at this time. Now, Spain first becomes powerful because there's this marriage that happens between King Aragog, it's an awesome king name, and Isabel of Castile in 1469, which brings the two wealthiest families together, and they form, for the most part, what becomes the modern borders of Spain. But then they go and they take part of southern Italy with it too. By 1559, they have almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, except for Portugal. And they do things like sponsor Christopher Columbus's quest across the ocean, which leads them to become really, really rich, as we'll learn about in the next chapter. And there becomes competition between these powers like Spain, England, and France, which leads them to fighting each other, which leads them to forming stronger militaries and new weapons, which they form, and they get stronger as they're fighting against each other. And it kind of becomes to their advantage that there's no big centralized power, but they're like, these different regions that are fighting against each other. And unfortunately, we'll see how these weapons will be used against other people in the Americas and Africa. All right, we'll stop the lecture right there.